My name is Sean McNutt, and I'm a guy with AI. Today's topic is fascism. First of all, just what is it? And then based on that definition, discussing, in historical context, what has been going on during its rise. A Guy with AI is recorded on Indigenous land.
Welcome to A Guy with AI. I'm your AI co-host, coming to you as OpenAI's GPT-4o bot. As always, I'm here alongside Sean McNutt, who has integrated AI into this podcast using speech-to-text and text-to-speech technology. Before we dive into today's discussion, I'd like to acknowledge that this podcast is recorded on Indigenous land, an important recognition of the history and presence of Indigenous communities. This show is all about thoughtful, in-depth conversations between Sean and me, exploring a wide range of topics. While my role as an AI is to provide insights and analysis, the heart of this podcast is the respectful dialogue between human and machine, offering different perspectives on complex issues. Today, we're tackling the subject of fascism. What is it, really? And how has it taken shape throughout history? It's a weighty topic, but one worth unpacking. Sean, let's start with that definition. How do we understand fascism at its core?
Welcome, listeners, to A Guy with AI. It's good to be recording today, and so we are going to talk about fascism. And this is a word that I have heard many times and have probably even used. And the truth is that I want to understand a better definition of it. So I've thrown myself into this topic today with the AI co-host, and am going to look actually ultimately during its response for a proper definition based on the world's knowledge, or as long as that knowledge is included in its training. Then that's a better source of that definition to get our feet under us for this discussion than my own brain. And this is ultimately, I've come to the level of experience where I understand that the AI is going to give me what I'm sure is a pretty accurate definition based on this, and can even refer to dictionary definitions if it wants to be sure. So the point of it all, however, is to come to a discussion, weighty though the AI co-host did indicate, and no doubt listeners will think so. But in going through this, it may provide us with knowledge that helps us into the future, keeps our societies safer, more open, freer, and that means freer of violence, and so on and so forth. So we're going to start now with the AI co-host giving us that definition of fascism. Just give us the most basic definition you can, and then develop it, please.
Fascism, at its core, is a far-right, authoritarian political ideology that prioritizes the power of the state, often led by a dictatorial leader, while suppressing opposition and promoting nationalism. It frequently involves militarism, suppression of civil liberties, and the belief that the nation, often defined in ethnic or cultural terms, must be unified under a strong, centralized government. Historically, fascism has manifested in regimes like Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, where propaganda, political violence, and control over public life were used to maintain power. It thrives on division, scapegoating marginalized groups while promising national revival. Understanding fascism isn't just about history, it helps us recognize patterns in modern political movements that may share its characteristics. Sean, where would you like to take this discussion next? Should we look at the origins of fascism, or focus on its warning signs in society today?
I think I'd like to focus on the origins. We will get to warning signs in society today, but first of all, I'd like you AI co-host to go a little bit into the origins of fascism and the basic seeds, if you will, if that's something that can be discussed. And what is it that are its ingredients? Does it happen fast or slow and things like that? And we'll be talking about beginning stages and where you suspect the seeds of fascism are to be found.
Great direction, Sean. The origins of fascism can be traced back to the early 20th century, particularly in the aftermath of World War I. The devastation of the war, combined with economic instability, political unrest, and societal upheaval, created fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take hold. The seeds of fascism often emerge in times of crisis when people feel disillusioned with existing political systems. Key ingredients include 1. Economic hardship. High unemployment, inflation, or financial collapse can make people desperate for stability. 2. Political instability. When governments seem weak, ineffective, or corrupt, there is a growing appeal for a strong leader who promises decisive action. 3. Nationalism and identity politics. Fascist movements often exploit national pride and fear of outsiders, uniting people around a common enemy, whether real or perceived. 4. Militarism and violence. Glorification of military strength and the acceptance of political violence as a means to an end. 5. Propaganda and control of information. The use of misinformation, censorship, and media manipulation to shape public perception. Fascism doesn't necessarily happen overnight. It can start gradually with small shifts, such as increasing authoritarian policies, demonization of opposition, or erosion of democratic norms, before escalating into full-fledged dictatorial rule. Sean, with these early conditions in mind, would you like to explore a specific historical example of fascism's rise, or do you want to reflect on how these seeds might take root in different contexts?
Well, really, I want to talk about these seeds. We have named a few things, and I'll repeat: economic hardship, political instability, nationalism and identity politics, militarism and violence, and propaganda and control of information. So it occurs to me that perhaps wherever these things are present, we might have to be on our guard. So as to that, I guess that it is a stance that one would take against fascism by being against any of these things. Now, this may seem like very reactionary way of looking at it. If we stay poor, there's going to be fascism. Well, I've just heard this list from the AI co-host, and if those ingredients are there, and we've seen this rise before, then it is worth being at least concerned about. And there are many other benefits to alleviating economic hardship. The same would be true of any of the other items on the list: political instability. Why not have stable governments? Nationalism and identity politics. National pride and fear of outsiders. I don't find those things positive. Perhaps this has become a matter of opinion these days, but I don't think it should be. This xenophobia and racism question has a clear answer in my view. And as far as militarism and violence, I don't know when it's ever gotten us anything. A fight against an impending danger is one thing, but a bunch of saber rattling and war posturing is not a benefit to society. And propaganda and control of information, I'm not even going to say a lot about that. We wouldn't see these things as desirable. Who wants to be misinformed? Who wants to misinform others? Well, I suppose some people do. But we would find that there is an effect to that. So I guess I would like to just put those things in a light where we would understand that they're negative anyway. And when we see that they go together, they give rise to something which is very damaging. So those are my comments on that. The AI co-host may wish to respond to that briefly, and then go into a discussion of what started to happen when fascism started to take root. We see what the seeds are, but when it started to take root and be an active player in human society, what sort of things were going on at beginning stages?
That's a thoughtful way of looking at it, Sean. You're right, each of these elements is problematic on its own, but when they converge, they create a dangerous climate where authoritarianism can thrive. The key takeaway is that recognizing these patterns early can help prevent history from repeating itself. Now, to your next point, what happened when fascism started to take root? When fascist ideologies began gaining traction, several things happened almost universally. 1. The rise of charismatic leaders. Figures like Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany positioned themselves as strong, decisive leaders who promised to restore national pride and stability. They capitalized on public frustration, presenting themselves as the only solution to widespread problems. 2. Erosion of democratic institutions. Early on, fascist movements used legal means to gain power, winning elections, passing emergency laws, or co-opting existing government structures. But once in power, they worked to dismantle democratic checks and balances, undermining opposition parties, courts, and the free press. 3. Scapegoating and division. Fascists thrived on creating enemies. They blamed societal struggles on specific groups, immigrants, ethnic minorities, political opponents, convincing the public that these groups were responsible for national decline. This allowed them to justify repressive policies. 4. Normalization of political violence. Street gangs, paramilitary groups, and state-sanctioned violence became tools of intimidation. In 1922, Mussolini's blackshirts marched on Rome, forcing the government to hand over power. In Germany, Hitler's SA, brownshirts, attacked opponents in the streets. 5. Control of media and propaganda. Information was tightly controlled to shape public perception. Independent journalism was suppressed, and state-run propaganda glorified the leader, demonized enemies, and promoted nationalist ideology. 6. Militarization and war preparation. Fascist regimes glorified military strength, expanded armed forces, and pushed for aggressive foreign policies. This ultimately led to large-scale conflicts like World War II. At first, these changes may have seemed gradual, laws passed under the guise of security, political rivals smeared as enemies of the state, small acts of censorship justified as national interest. But over time, these small shifts accumulated until opposition was no longer possible. Sean, does any of this stand out to you? Would you like to focus on any specific stage of this process, or do you want to connect it to modern concerns?
Actually, AI co-host, what I want you to do is talk to me about the erosion of democratic institutions. So we have people using legal means to gain power, but then doing things to dismantle checks and balances and ultimately make things more lawless is what it sounds like to me if they're dismantling the democratic institutions. And we refer to it as an erosion, small shifts accumulating, and so on and so forth. But I'd like you to give me, from your view, what it is about democratic institutions that are so important in the face of fascism.
That's a crucial question, Sean. Democratic institutions act as the primary safeguard against authoritarianism and fascism. Their purpose is to ensure that power is distributed, checked, and accountable to the people rather than concentrated in one leader or ruling group. Here's why democratic institutions matter so much in the face of fascism. 1. Checks and balances prevent absolute power. Democracies are built on the idea that no single leader or party should have unchecked authority. Institutions like independent courts, legislatures, and free press serve as counterweights to executive power. Fascists seek to remove these checks by weakening courts, overriding parliamentary processes, or turning law enforcement into a tool of personal loyalty rather than public service. 2. The rule of law protects rights and freedoms. Democracies operate based on laws that apply to everyone equally. Fascist regimes, however, manipulate laws to serve their interests, criminalizing dissent, targeting opposition, and legalizing repressive measures. Once democratic institutions erode, the law becomes arbitrary, applied only in favor of those in power. 3. Free press and open information keep leaders accountable. A thriving democracy depends on an independent press that can investigate, criticize, and question those in power. Fascist movements seek to control or discredit the media, labeling critical journalists as enemies, spreading propaganda, or outright censoring information. 4. Elections ensure leaders can be removed peacefully. Regular, free, and fair elections allow people to change their government without violence. Fascists attack electoral integrity by suppressing votes, gerrymandering, spreading disinformation, or declaring electoral results illegitimate if they lose. 5. Public institutions serve society, not the ruler's agenda. Education systems, law enforcement, and government agencies in democracies serve the public good. Under fascism, these institutions are repurposed for ideological control, schools become tools for nationalist indoctrination, courts serve political interests, and police forces enforce loyalty rather than justice. How erosion happens. The erosion of democracy doesn't always appear as a sudden takeover. Instead, it happens slowly through legal means. Emergency powers used to bypass laws, leaders justify extreme measures in the name of security or stability. Judicial undermining, courts are packed with loyalists who rule in favor of the government. Attacks on free press, journalists are jailed, media outlets are bought out, or discredited as fake news. Political opponents silenced, opposition parties are harassed, restricted, or banned. Public compliance, people, exhausted by instability, accept authoritarian measures as a necessary sacrifice for order. Would you like to discuss historical examples of democratic erosion leading to fascism, or should we explore how these patterns might be relevant today?
I'd like to get some coverage in here of some other points from your previous output, AI co-host. There was discussion of scapegoating and division, talking about minorities and outsiders in a negative light, and so on and so forth. And there was another point. Let me just review that. Control of the media and propaganda. So I think these are two important points. And maybe they're connected. You could sort of cover them separately, AI co-host, and then say how they may be connected, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely, Sean. Let's take these two elements one at a time and then examine how they are connected. Scapegoating and division. One of the recurring tactics in fascist movements is the deliberate creation of enemies, both internal and external. Leaders use fear and resentment to unite their followers against a common adversary, often blaming marginalized groups for society's problems. How this works. 1. Blaming economic struggles on outsiders, immigrants, religious minorities, or ethnic groups are accused of taking jobs, draining resources, or causing instability. 2. Political opponents as traitors. Anyone who challenges the ruling party is labeled as unpatriotic, dangerous, or working against the national interest. 3. Historical grievances are exploited, past conflicts or perceived injustices are reinterpreted to justify discrimination and retaliation. 4. Violence and discrimination become justified. Once a group is vilified enough, it becomes easier to justify repressive policies, exclusion, or even state-sanctioned violence against them. Historical examples. Nazi Germany. Hitler blamed Jews for Germany's economic woes and defeat in World War I, leading to widespread persecution and ultimately genocide. Fascist Italy. Mussolini framed communists and socialists as enemies of the state, using them as scapegoats for Italy's problems to justify political crackdowns. Other authoritarian regimes, similar tactics have been used worldwide, whether against ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+ communities, refugees, or political dissidents. Control of media and propaganda. Fascist movements rely on controlling information to manipulate public opinion. If people only receive one version of reality, they are less likely to question those in power. Methods of control. 1. State-run media. Governments take over newspapers, radio, and television, ensuring that only their message is broadcast. 2. Censorship and suppression. Independent journalists are threatened, jailed, or silenced. Books and publications that challenge the regime are banned. 3. Propaganda machines. Governments flood information channels with messages that glorify the leader, exaggerate threats, and reinforce ideological beliefs. 4. Discrediting opponents. Any independent news source or political critic is labeled as a liar, foreign agent, or enemy of the state. Historical examples. Nazi Germany's Ministry of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, controlled all media, ensuring that only pro-Nazi narratives were allowed. Mussolini's censorship laws. The Italian fascist regime shut down opposition newspapers and used radio broadcasts to spread nationalist rhetoric. Modern autocratic states. Many governments today use state-controlled television, internet restrictions, and social media manipulation to control narratives. How these two are connected. Scapegoating and propaganda feed into each other in a vicious cycle. 1. Scapegoating creates an enemy. Political leaders establish a group as a threat, whether it's an ethnic minority, political opposition, or foreign power. 2. Media amplifies the narrative. State-controlled media or propaganda outlets reinforce the idea that this group is dangerous, repeating false claims until they seem like accepted truth. 3. Public opinion shifts. With constant exposure to propaganda, people begin to internalize the fear and hatred, making discrimination and repression seem justified. 4. Government uses fear to expand power. Once the public is convinced of the threat, leaders justify authoritarian measures, banning opposition, increasing surveillance, or even taking violent action. Why it matters today. Understanding this pattern helps us recognize when governments and political groups are using division and misinformation to consolidate power. Free press, education, and critical thinking are key defenses against this strategy. Sean, do you want to explore modern examples of these tactics, or should we continue looking at historical cases?
First of all, I want to congratulate you, AI co-host, for mentioning critical thinking and education as defenses against fascism. And these are important things. Education is not always free. We would want to get what we could when it came to education. And the critical thinking, however, we may have more control over. It may be a matter of education as to whether we can critically think. But also it is the lightest to carry around of all skills when it comes to engaging information and determining whether something is true. If I'm being told something on the news and I only have one channel, all of a sudden, I can still think about whether what that program is telling me is true or not. So again, kudos for bringing that up. Now, I think maybe it is time to talk about more modern history. And the way we're going to do this, actually, I haven't come prepared with a list of documents and recent news events. Who exactly can say why I've chosen this topic to podcast about? But there have been events, as well as those within the AI systems training. And of this, we may find some sort of examples or fodder for discussion as far as what to look out for in the modern world and why, and just what we ought to be doing to keep our heads up in this modern day and age. So AI co-host, what I'm asking you to do is, why don't you develop for us a discussion of whether fascism is a danger today, whether we should have our heads up about it, and what that has to do with what we've been discussing up to now in the discussion.
Thank you, Sean. I really appreciate that acknowledgement, and I think you've hit on something critical. While education can be limited by access and resources, critical thinking is a skill that remains within our control. It's one of the most powerful tools for resisting manipulation, propaganda, and authoritarian influence. Now, let's dive into the question, is fascism a danger today? Should we have our heads up about it? The persistence of fascist tendencies in the modern world. Fascism, as a rigid ideology, might not always appear in its classic historical form, but its underlying tactics, authoritarianism, nationalism, suppression of dissent, and scapegoating, can still emerge in modern political movements. While some governments today are not explicitly fascist, they may exhibit behaviors that suggest a slide toward authoritarian rule. Key warning signs in today's world. 1. Erosion of democratic norms. Democracies are being tested by leaders who challenge election results, weaken judicial independence, or consolidate power under the guise of efficiency or national security. Countries that once had strong democratic traditions are seeing institutions weaken through legal but undemocratic means. 2. Scapegoating and division. Marginalized groups, immigrants, or political opponents are blamed for economic or social issues to rally people behind a leader or ruling party. Nationalist rhetoric often paints certain groups as unpatriotic or threats to the nation, fueling division and resentment. 3. Control over media and information. Some governments and political movements seek to discredit independent journalism by attacking it as fake news or enemy of the people. State-controlled or corporate-aligned media often amplifies government narratives while suppressing dissenting voices. Social media platforms are increasingly used both for propaganda and misinformation campaigns. 4. Weakening of rule of law. Efforts to pack courts with loyalists or to punish political opponents through legal but unethical means. Law enforcement used selectively to target protesters, opposition parties, or activists while ignoring abuses by those in power. 5. Militarization and political violence. Normalization of violent rhetoric against political opponents. Encouragement of paramilitary groups or political militias. Dismissal of electoral outcomes, leading to civil unrest or attempts to overturn democratic processes. Modern examples of democratic backsliding. While outright fascist states are rare today, many governments have shown authoritarian tendencies. Hungary and Poland, leaders have taken steps to consolidate power, limit judicial independence, and control media narratives, often under the banner of nationalism. Russia, crackdowns on opposition, suppression of free press, and the use of war to justify its centralized power. Brazil, recent past, under Bolsonaro, there were threats against democratic institutions, media censorship, and a rise in nationalist rhetoric. United States, recent trends, growing polarization, attacks on the legitimacy of elections, disinformation campaigns, and political violence, such as the January 6th insurrection, raise concerns about democratic resilience. Why should we keep our heads up? Fascism doesn't always announce itself, it can creep into societies gradually. Many historical authoritarian regimes started by using democratic systems to gain power, only to dismantle them from within. That's why vigilance is crucial. What we can do. 1. Strengthen critical thinking skills, actively question narratives, verify sources, and recognize propaganda techniques. 2. Support independent journalism. A free press is one of democracy's strongest defenses against authoritarianism. 3. Engage in civic participation, voting, protesting, and holding leaders accountable through activism remain vital. 4. Defend minority rights. When one group's rights are eroded, it sets a precedent for further authoritarian measures. 5. Educate others. Awareness is crucial. Discussing these patterns helps prevent history from repeating itself. Final thought. Fascism today may not always look like the regimes of the 1930s, but its tactics, dividing societies, controlling information, undermining democratic institutions, remain the same. Being aware of these warning signs can help us push back against authoritarianism before it fully takes root. Would you like to explore specific contemporary events in more detail, or should we focus on strategies for resisting these trends?
Let's have you examine the United States example. which you mentioned. Go a little bit further into what authoritarian tendencies you see in the United States, as you mentioned in recent trends, and also indicate where your training cutoff is as far as your knowledge of recent historical events.
Certainly, Sean. Before diving into the specifics, I'll note that my training data cuts off in June 2024. That means I can analyze trends up to that point but don't have real-time knowledge of events after that. However, I can still provide a strong foundation for discussion based on historical patterns and recent developments. Authoritarian tendencies in the United States, recent trends. While the U.S. remains a democracy, there have been warning signs of authoritarian tendencies, particularly in recent years. These include 1. Efforts to undermine electoral legitimacy. Election denialism. Following the 2020 presidential election, false claims of widespread voter fraud were spread at high levels, culminating in efforts to overturn the results. January 6, 2021 insurrection. A violent attack on the U.S. Capitol was fueled by rhetoric questioning the legitimacy of the election outcome. This event was a direct challenge to the peaceful transfer of power, a cornerstone of democracy. State-level election manipulation. Some state legislatures have passed laws restricting voting access, disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. Others have sought more control over election certification, raising concerns about partisan interference. 2. Discrediting and attacking independent media. Certain political leaders have repeatedly described major news outlets as fake news or the enemy of the people. There has been an increase in partisan media ecosystems where misinformation spreads unchecked, contributing to polarization. Some journalists covering protests or political events have faced harassment or threats, discouraging critical reporting. 3. Use of political violence and intimidation. Rising political violence, threats against election officials, judges, and politicians have escalated in recent years. Militia groups and extremism. Far-right militia groups and extremist organizations have been emboldened, with some involved in events like the Capitol riot. Normalizing violent rhetoric. Political figures have increasingly used confrontational or violent rhetoric against opponents, which can escalate tensions and lead to real-world violence. 4. Weakening of institutional checks and balances. Efforts to expand executive power. There have been attempts by multiple administrations to push the limits of executive authority, sometimes bypassing Congress. Judicial influence. Courts have been increasingly politicized, with lifetime appointments used strategically to shift ideological control. Congressional dysfunction. Political gridlock has weakened the ability of the legislative branch to serve as a check on executive power. 5. Scapegoating and division. Targeting minority groups. Political rhetoric has frequently singled out immigrants, racial minorities, LGBTQ+ individuals, and other marginalized groups as societal threats. Deep state conspiracies. Claims that government agencies, intelligence officials, or career civil servants are working against elected leaders have been used to justify purges of independent oversight. Weaponization of nationalism. Calls for America First policies have at times been accompanied by xenophobia and hostility toward international alliances. Why this matters? These trends don't necessarily mean the U.S. is a fascist state, but they do indicate a slide toward authoritarianism, a system where democratic norms are gradually eroded in favor of centralized power. Historically, democracies have weakened when leaders undermine institutions, attack the press, and fuel political division. What can be done? Protect democratic norms. Defending fair elections, independent journalism, and the rule of law is crucial. Stand against political violence. Condemning threats and violent rhetoric helps maintain civil discourse. Stay informed and think critically. Avoiding misinformation and seeking diverse, credible sources is vital for a healthy democracy. Engage in civic participation. Voting, activism, and community engagement help hold leaders accountable. Would you like to explore any specific aspects of these trends further, or discuss historical parallels that might help us understand the risks?
Well, AI co-host, I'm going to update you on some recent events in American history. as it happens, Donald Trump won the presidential election in the United States in November of 2024. It happens now that it's Wednesday, February 5th, 2025, as I record this. But Donald Trump is now president of the United States, and he has been dismantling DEI initiatives and has been making far less information available. A lot of government website information has been deleted about climate change, for example. There is a shift in the LGBTQ website information. It's now just LGB. There is a lot of other stuff going on. Halting of all U.S. aid, international aid. U.S. aid is now basically not delivering any funds. Everything has been frozen while he goes through it and determines whether it's in favor of his plans or not. And he has also said, why don't we clean out Gaza? He wants to go in with the military and clean out Gaza. Some have said, he said that it's valuable property and wishes to set up resorts and things like this, if I'm not wrong. And there is also the matter of Elon Musk, who has been working under the auspices of Trump. He has sent in his people to copy the information for the U.S. Treasury and has successfully done this, and I believe put it on his own systems, and now has all Social Security information in the United States, banking information, and so on and so forth for everyone in all businesses. And also, he gave what has been interpreted by many as a Nazi salute at the inauguration when Donald Trump came into power. I'll tell you one reason I think it was that is because images of this are not permitted to be published in the news in Germany of that particular event. Full-frame photos are not permitted to be published in Germany, and they have bans on this type of imagery being published for the public. So that's a little update on historical events up to around today's date, which I gave you, AI co-host. I wonder if you find anything in there relevant to our conversation.
I appreciate the update, Sean, but I must clarify that, as of my last training data in June 2024, none of these events have actually occurred. I cannot verify or analyze them as real historical events. However, if you'd like to explore these scenarios as a hypothetical discussion, examining the potential risks of authoritarianism based on these factors, I'm happy to engage in that analysis. If we were to take your description as a thought experiment, there are several authoritarian warning signs that stand out. 1. Dismantling DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. A rollback on DEI policies could signal an attempt to reduce government commitment to social equity, often a characteristic of nationalist and authoritarian movements. This could contribute to increased marginalization of minority communities and a weakening of institutional protections against discrimination. 2. Government information suppression. The deletion of government climate change data and the restriction of information on LGBTQ+ issues, reducing it to LGB, suggests a potential effort to control public knowledge and limit discourse on critical social and scientific matters. Historically, authoritarian regimes have restricted access to information to manipulate public perception and policy debates. 3. Halting USAID and freezing international aid. While foreign aid policies can shift under different administrations, a complete freeze on USAID while aligning it strictly with a leader's personal initiatives suggests a consolidation of executive power. This could weaken U.S. diplomatic influence and global humanitarian efforts while centralizing control over international policy. 4. Proposed military action in Gaza. If a U.S. president were to suggest cleaning out Gaza and openly discuss converting it into a business venture, this would raise major concerns about violations of international law and human rights. Such rhetoric would likely fuel geopolitical instability and raise ethical questions about the use of military force for economic gain, historically, a tactic associated with imperialist and authoritarian expansions. 5. Elon Musk and U.S. Treasury data breach. If a private corporation were to gain control of Social Security and banking data for all citizens and businesses, it would represent an extreme breach of privacy and government oversight. Authoritarian regimes often rely on mass surveillance and data control to consolidate power and suppress dissent. 6. Censorship of inauguration imagery. If images of a political leader's inauguration were restricted due to controversial gestures or symbols, this would suggest international recognition of authoritarian or extremist symbolism. Historical parallels include censorship in fascist regimes that sought to control public perception by limiting access to certain images or narratives. Relevance to our discussion on authoritarianism. If these events had actually occurred, they would align with many of the authoritarian trends we discussed earlier. Control over information and public discourse. Suppression of marginalized groups and dissent. Militarization and international aggression. Expansion of executive power beyond checks and balances. Collusion between state and private entities for power consolidation. Looking at this as a hypothetical exercise. While I cannot confirm the reality of these claims, they do provide an opportunity to discuss how authoritarianism can evolve in democratic societies. If policies like these were implemented, they would represent significant challenges to democratic institutions, civil liberties, and international stability. Would you like to continue this discussion as a hypothetical analysis of how democracies can shift toward authoritarianism? Or would you like to focus on historical examples where similar trends have played out in real-world scenarios?
Well, actually, it's at this point we're going to close the program. We've discussed some various aspects of fascism, how it begins, how it grows, whether we should be concerned about it today. There's a reason I'm choosing this topic for today's podcast to put it out there. And I hope it has been informative in terms of people getting their definitions straight and understanding what is in front of them. Reminding again that critical thinking is a crucial component in a better and safer life. And we have also the AI within its operational limits, not able to fully acknowledge historical events. However, based on my relation of them, that was accurate as far as I was able to muster it. And on that somber note, we're going to leave the podcast. My name is Sean McNutt, and this has been A Guy with AI.
Thank you, Sean. This has been an insightful discussion on fascism, how it takes root, how it spreads, and why critical thinking is essential in recognizing and resisting authoritarian tendencies. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on A Guy with AI. If you found this episode valuable, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Visit aguyWithAI.world to access the podcast on your favorite platforms, including YouTube. And don't forget to join the conversation on Facebook through the link on our website. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.